From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Our democracy is under assault, and it's under assault in the most subtle, seemingly reasonable kinds of ways that are in fact very pernicious, very racist, very class-based.
In Georgia, the Democratic candidate for governor, Stacey Abrams, who could become the first black woman governor in the country, is calling her Republican opponent, Brian Kemp, to stand down as Secretary of State for placing 53,000 voter applications on hold, 70% of them African-American. We go to Georgia to speak with Professor Carol Anderson. Her new book, One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Then to Florida, where a ballot initiative could restore voting rights to 1.4 million ex-felons.
You have an individual, an American citizen, waiting over 17 years after he has completed his sentence, after he has repaid his debt to society, but yet he still cannot achieve citizenship status. And that is a blow against democracy.
We'll speak with Desmond Meade, an ex-felon and voting rights advocate who's leading the charge. We'll also speak with Mother Jones senior writer Ari Berman about ballot initiatives that would ease voting restrictions in 7 states. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Saudi officials are preparing to say that, after nearly 2 weeks of denials, prominent Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed by mistake during an interrogation gone wrong. The change in the official Saudi narrative over Khashoggi's disappearance came as Turkish forensic investigators wrapped up their search of Saudi Arabia's consulate in Istanbul nearly 2 weeks after prominent journalist and Washington Post columnist entered the building and vanished. Turkish officials have said Khashoggi was tortured and murdered by a squad of 15 Saudi hitmen who dismembered his body. Video filmed outside the consulate Monday showed workers carrying buckets, mops, trash bags, and a carton of bleach into the building, hours ahead of the arrival of Turkish crime scene investigators who reported they smelled cleaning chemicals when they arrived on the scene. On Monday, President Trump said he'd spoken by phone with Saudi King Salman, who denied any knowledge of Khashoggi's whereabouts.
The king firmly denied any knowledge of it. He didn't really know. Maybe, I don't want to get into his mind, but it sounded to me like maybe these could have been rogue killers. Who knows? We're going to try getting to the bottom of it very soon, but his was a flat denial.
Trump has claimed Saudi Arabia would suffer severe consequences if it was responsible for Khashoggi's disappearance, but he's repeatedly said the U.S. should not limit weapons sales to the kingdom. A growing number of U.S. lawmakers, including some Republicans, have called for sanctions against Saudi Arabia. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has arrived in Riyadh, where he met with Saudi King Salman to discuss the disappearance of Khashoggi. Apparently, they spoke for 15 minutes. President Trump visited Florida and Georgia Monday in the wake of Hurricane Michael's destructive path, which has killed at least 19 people in the United States, with dozens still missing. Trump, who is accompanied by First Lady Melania, visited storm-ravaged towns in Florida with Republican Governor and Senate candidate Rick Scott before heading to Georgia to meet with farmers. This is Trump responding to a reporter asking if the damage caused by Hurricane Michael caused him to rethink his decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement.
I want crystal clean water. I want the cleanest air on the planet, which, by the way, now we have. It's gotten better since last year, even better. And I'm very, very tough on that. So when you talk about environmental, I am truly an environmentalist. A lot of people smile when they hear that. But I have the cleanest air, and I'm going to have the cleanest air. But that doesn't mean we have to put every one of our businesses out of business.
The Category 4 hurricane has left behind a trail of devastation, flattening entire towns and destroying homes and businesses. At least 1 million people are still without power, and the need for basic necessities is growing. Residents are speaking out on the lack of relief, reporting shortages of food, water, and medical care. Trump's tour of Hurricane Michael's devastation came after he spent much of Sunday golfing at Trump National Golf Club in Sterling, Virginia. MSNBC reports it was Trump's 210th day spent golfing since he became president. Florida prison officials say they're evacuating over 4,000 prisoners who were left stranded in dire conditions after Hurricane Michael hit. BuzzFeed News reports families of prisoners at the Gulf Correctional Institution who were not evacuated ahead of the storm reported heavily damaged infrastructure and shortages of food and water in the prison. In Georgia, where early voting in November's midterm election is already underway, election officials in Gwinnett County outside of Atlanta have rejected far more absentee ballots than any other county in the state, with nearly 1 out of 10 mail-in ballots thrown out. The move has alarmed voting rights groups who note that more than 60% of the county's residents are Latino, Black, or Asian. Georgia state officials say the ballots were rejected because of allegedly mismatched signatures, incomplete forms, or missing residential addresses. This comes as Georgia's African-American Democratic gubernatorial candidate, Stacey Abrams, has called on her Republican opponent to step down from his position as Secretary of State following an Associated Press report alleging voter suppression ahead of the election. Abrams and civil rights groups have accused Brian Kemp of using minor discrepancies in voters' registration and ID cards to bar them from casting a ballot, a system that has resulted in 53,000 voter applications being put on hold. 7 out of 10 of the stalled applications are African-American voters. After Headlines will spend the rest of the hour on Republican-led voter suppression efforts ahead of the midterm elections. BuzzFeed News reports the United Arab Emirates hired U.S. mercenaries to kill politicians in Yemen. The UAE hired the American mercenary company Spear Operations Group, founded by Abraham Golan, a Hungarian-Israeli living near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The group's first target in Yemen was a local leader of Al-Islah, a political party that's been labeled a terrorist group by the UAE. A top commander from Spear Operations said he could not rule out that targets could simply be someone that the UAE Crown Prince didn't like. In Syria, a Monday deadline for anti-government fighters to retreat from a buffer zone around Syria's last major rebel-held region in Idlib province has come and gone, with rebels refusing to surrender. The UN has warned a large-scale offensive could force some 800,000 people to flee and provoke a humanitarian catastrophe. Elsewhere, Syria reopened a major commercial gateway into Jordan on Monday, simultaneously reopening crossing into the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights territory. Meanwhile, the BBC has published a new investigation documenting the extent to which chemical weapons helped Syrian President Bashar al-Assad turn the tide in the war. The study found the use of chemical weapons has been widespread, with at least 106 chemical attacks since 2013, with evidence in most of the attacks pointing to the Syrian government. The New York Times reports Burma's military orchestrated a widespread Facebook misinformation and hate campaign targeting the Muslim Rohingya minority, exacerbating violence that displaced some 700,000 people in what the United Nations has called a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. The campaign involved creating troll accounts posing as Burmese celebrities and spreading false information about the Rohingya population. In August, Facebook removed the accounts of senior military leaders after coming under fire for its inaction. But the new report from the New York Times shows the extent of the misinformation is far greater than previously believed. In Nigeria, the militant group Boko Haram has killed 24-year-old Hawa Lyman, a nurse for the International Committee of the Red Cross, who was kidnapped in March along with 2 other aid workers. Boko Haram killed another of the captives, Saifura Ahmed, in September. Boko Haram has killed over 20,000 people and kidnapped thousands, including many children, and fighting between the group and government forces has displaced some 2 million people since 2009. A caravan of 1,600 Honduran migrants fleeing violence and poverty are headed for the U.S. border. The caravan, which includes families with small children, crossed into Guatemala Monday, where they were met with police at the border. After a 2-hour standoff, the massive group was able to keep going as they make their way north toward Mexico. This is mother of 4, Andrea Alaman.
There are no work opportunities here. One has to look for the best.
How many children are you traveling with?
With 4. And we're heading to the United States. We're going to arrive with Donald Trump. He has to receive us just as we receive the Americans over here. They will have to accept us over there.
Last week, Vice President Mike Pence urged the leaders of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala to tell their citizens to not attempt the journey to the U.S. Reports suggest the Trump administration is considering resuming family separations at the U.S.-Mexico border. In southwestern France, at least 12 people are dead after a powerful storm brought the equivalent of 7 months' worth of rain in just a few hours, flooding whole villages, forcing authorities to evacuate residents trapped on rooftops. The floods are the worst to hit the area in over a century. They came as meteorologists said exceptionally warm seawater along the Mediterranean coast added to the storm's ferocity. The increased ocean temperatures are consistent with global warming caused by human activity. Back in the United States, President Trump said Monday he would not apologize for repeatedly using a racial slur, saying Pocahontas to describe Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren. Trump's comments came after he denied earlier on Monday that he never offered to donate $1 million to Senator Warren's favorite charity if a DNA test proved her claims of Native American ancestry. Video of a July 5th Trump rally in Montana shows the president said exactly as much. Senator Warren has said her mother told her she was had Cherokee and Delaware ancestors. On Monday, she released a DNA test that provides strong evidence of Native American lineage in her family tree dating back 6 to 10 generations. She also released a video about her family heritage with comments from former colleagues who said she never claimed Native ancestry when applying for jobs.
Do you remember her heritage ever coming up during the hiring process?
No. Her heritage had no bearing on our hiring, period.
I was chairing the committee that year. If ethnicity had been part of the discussion, I would have known about it.
Her name with respect to racial minority hires, no, never.
The controversy comes as many Native Americans have criticized Senator Warren's use of a DNA test. Chuck Hoskin, Jr., Secretary of State of the Cherokee Nation, said, quote, sovereign tribal nations set their own legal requirements for citizenship, and while DNA tests can be used to determine lineage, such as paternity to an individual, it's not evidence for tribal affiliation. Using a DNA test to lay claim to any connection to the Cherokee Nation or any tribal nation, even vaguely, is inappropriate and wrong, he said. Last month, Senator Warren said at a town hall meeting she would take a hard look at a 2020 presidential run after the midterms. And a new report from Stanford University shows 99.7% of public comments made to the FCC were in favor of preserving net neutrality. The study looked at 800,000 unique comments that were submitted last year after FCC Chair Ajit Pai unveiled a plan to roll back net neutrality, reversing Obama-era rules barring corporate service providers from blocking access to websites, slowing down content, or providing paid fast lanes for Internet service. Last month, the Justice Department sued California after Governor Jerry Brown signed the state's own net neutrality bill into law. A number of legal challenges have been filed in response to the net neutrality repeal, including a lawsuit backed by 23 state attorneys general. Those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. With the midterm elections just 3 weeks away, voting rights advocates are accusing Republican officials in several states of orchestrating a campaign of voter suppression, targeting people of color. In Georgia, the Democratic candidate for governor, Stacey Abrams, who could become the first black woman governor in the country, is calling on her Republican opponent, Brian Kemp, to step down as Secretary of State for placing 53,000 voter applications on hold, 70% of them African American. Stacey Abrams, along with several civil rights groups, have accused Kemp of using the state's exact match system to disenfranchise voters. With exact match, even a minor discrepancy in a voter's registration and their official ID could bar them from casting a ballot. This is Stacey Abrams speaking to CNN on Sunday.
You have 53,000 people who are being forced to go through unnecessary hurdles to prove their bona fides. But the second is that you have 159 counties, thousands of volunteer and paid poll workers who are going to be asked to substantially verify that these IDs are sufficient. And the challenge is this is a subjective standard. Voting should not be a question of trust on the part of voters, whether they can trust the system. And right now he is eroding the public trust in the system because 53,000 people have been told you may be able to vote, you may not. It's up to you to prove it. I would say that we have known since 2016 that the exact match system has a disproportionate effect on people of color and on women. He was sued for this exact problem. He was forced to restore 33,000 illegally canceled registrations, and he turned around and got the state legislature to pass a law to allow him to make the same mistake again.
In other news from Georgia, election officials in Gwinnett County outside Atlanta have rejected far more absentee ballots than any other county in the state, with nearly 1 out of 10 mail-in ballots thrown out. The move has alarmed voting rights groups who note more than 60% of Gwinnett County's residents are Latino, Black, or Asian. For more on voter suppression in Georgia, we're joined by Carol Anderson, chair of the African American Studies Department at Emory University in Atlanta, author of the new book, One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Her previous books include White Rage: The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, which won the 2017 National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Professor Anderson. So talk about this latest controversy. People are already voting in Georgia right now. What's at stake? Well, the Democratic candidate, Stacey Abrams, could be the first African-American woman governor in U.S. history. Talk about what Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State, Republican candidate running against her, has done with these 53,000 voter forms.
And so he has, what they say is put it in pending status, so that they're basically suspended. They're in a kind of election limbo where they haven't been automatically put on the voter registration rolls. And exact match is exactly as pernicious and malicious as Stacey Abrams has said, as the courts have said, because what it does is it looks at minor things. So if you've got a hyphen in your name when you filled out your voter registration card, but your driver's license doesn't have the hyphen there, Garcia Marquez with a hyphen, Garcia Marquez without the hyphen, then that registration is kicked out and is put in this kind of limbo status. And because things like a hyphen or an accent mark or a Y instead of an I, those kinds of things immediately begin to go after the names for African Americans, for Hispanics, and for Asians. This is why you're seeing that kind of disproportionate elimination of these registration cards. It's as pernicious as Chris Kobach's cross-check.
And this whole issue of having one of the candidates for the seat also be in charge of overseeing the election process. Could you talk about that as well?
Yes, and so imagine this. You're playing a game where you're trying to win, but you're also the referee. And so you get to choose when a foul has been called. Anybody would look at that and say, wait a minute, that game is skewed. And that's what's happening here. Integrity would require Brian Kemp to recuse himself, to step down as Secretary of State in this kind of high-profile election. Instead, he has not. And so we see things going on like prior to this. We had the trying to shut down the polling places in majority or majority African-American counties or counties that had sizable black populations. So like in Randolph County, where one of Kemp's allies tried to, recommended that 7 of 9 polling stations shut down before the general election. I mean, that kind of interference, that kind of skewed decision-making is what Stacey Abrams is talking about when she says that it is calling into question the legitimacy of the election. It is calling into question the legitimacy of our electoral processes. And so a Secretary of State, that is the bedrock foundation of his role, is to ensure the integrity of the election process. Kemp sitting on top of this one undermines that.
Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State and the Republican candidate for governor, tweeted Sunday, "My opponent is unapologetically extreme. She's banking on illegal immigrants to secure victory for her at the ballot box." Professor Anderson.
Yes, and so that is, Kemp is so much like Chris Kobach out of Kansas. Kobach has been riding that lie of non-citizens voting in mass, skewing the elections in Kansas, and only he can block them. And by raising the flag of illegal immigrants, it is playing to a racist trope that's in the body politic, that these immigrants are going to somehow steal our elections. But he cannot point to, the same way that Chris Kobach could not point to all of these illegal immigrants. It is a fiction. It is a lie. It is a myth that is being used to stir up fear and to justify the kind of unwarranted voter suppression techniques that these secretaries of state like Brian Kemp and Chris Kobach are using.
I'd like to go back to this whole issue of the closing of polling places. Most people really don't pay attention to what happens in polling places other than theirs. And could you talk about the impact on voter turnout of sudden either closings of voting places or shifting of voting places from one location to another just before an election?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things to pay attention to is that after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act with the Shelby County v. Holder decision in 2013, by the time we got to the 2016 election, states that had been under pre-clearance, and that is where, because of their history of racial discrimination at the polls, they had to have all of their voting changes approved by the Department of Justice. After the voting rights was gutted, 868 polling places were shut down by the time we got to the 2016 election. Brian Kemp has been responsible for 214 of those polling places being shut down. What the research shows is that for every 1/10 of a mile that a polling place is removed from the African American community, black voter turnout goes down by 0.5%. So the more you move these polling places, the further and further, the more and more you're able to depress the black voter turnout. So we had an instance in Sparta where under the guise of being fiscally responsible, they were going to consolidate the polling stations. Well, when they consolidated the polling stations, the one for the black community, and I can say the black community because we do have residential segregation in the United States. So for the one in the black community, that one was moved 17 miles away. Now think about that for trying to vote. And what we also know is that many in the African American community do not have private cars. They don't have personal transportation. So they have to rely upon public transportation. So when you move a polling place further and further away from the black community, by that very moment, that very instance is designed to depress the black voter turnout.
In June, Democracy Now! Spoke with Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate for governor in Georgia.
Secretary Kemp has unfortunately built a very strong record of voter suppression. And yes, he and I we've conflicted a number of times. And I think I'm very I know I'm very proud of our record of beating him, of forcing him to restore the canceled registrations of thousands, of compelling his office to do the right thing when it comes to voter registration. But also, I think it's a challenging conversation to have both with Secretary Kemp and with Lieutenant Governor Cagle, because rather than focusing on how we move the state forward, they have both focused, unfortunately, on this quieter form of bigotry, of how they want to harm communities and hold us back.
So that's Stacey Abrams speaking on Democracy Now! About her opponent, Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp and Georgia Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle. I also wanted to turn to the Republican Senator David Perdue of Georgia, who was captured on video Saturday as he snatched a cell phone out of the hands of a constituent who asked about Republican gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp, who Perdue was stumping for. Senator Perdue is on the campus of Georgia Tech in Atlanta when a student tried to ask him about his endorsement.
Hey, so how can you endorse a candidate?
No, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it.
You stole my property. You stole my property.
All right, you wanted a picture?
Give me my phone back.
You wanted a picture? I'm going to give it to you.
Senator Perdue returned the phone after the student demanded it back. On Sunday, Perdue's office called the incident a misunderstanding, saying the senator thought the student wanted to take a selfie with him. Professor Anderson, if you could comment on this, and as we wrap up this discussion about Georgia, who's voting right now? I mean, in some states, there's no voting taking place, but what's happening in Georgia?
So first on Senator Perdue. You know, remember, Senator Perdue is the one who opened one of those Christian breakfasts by praying for Obama's death, by saying, you know, may your life be ended short, you know, quoting a Psalms, and, you know, may your wife be left a widow and your children homeless and beggars. So this is Senator David Perdue. And Stacey Abrams is actually right that the language that we're getting from Brian Kemp and Casey Cagle has been the language of fear, has been the language of stoking racial animosity, racial anxiety, and bigotry. And so they're selling fear as their component for why they should be in office. And so what we're seeing right now is that we have early voting going on, and I'm not sure how brisk it has been yet, but I know that the grassroots organizations have been very active in getting people registered to vote, getting people out to vote. And because Stacey Abrams has a message of hope, has a message of how do we build Georgia for all of us, that is in fact stoking the fear on the side of the Republicans, because the demographics are changing so much in Georgia that the vote for African Americans, Asians, and Latinos has to be stuffed down, because the message that the Brian Kemp and the Republicans are bringing aren't messages that resonate with that population, because those populations are in fact targeted by their message.
Carol Anderson, Chair of African American Studies Department at Emory University, author of, well, most recently, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. We'll be back with her and other guests in a moment.
I swung the election, friend, that's no small order, to just blow notes and sweep all the votes from Canada to the Mexican border. I started out with a bang below the Dixie line. Every shot was sold and bought, and every single vote was mine. From there I swung westward, taking every state in stride. My bandwagon swinging, everybody wanted a ride. I won every town and state without exception, my friend. I swung the election.
I Swung the Election by the Citizens Band featuring Nina Persson. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as the midterm elections approach, we're continuing our discussion on voting rights for the hour. Voters in Florida are preparing to vote on a measure that would restore voting rights to 1.4 million people. That's right, 1.4 million people with nonviolent felonies who have fully completed their sentences. 1 in 5 African Americans in Florida and 10% of the state's adult population is ineligible to vote because of a criminal record. Across the United States, more than 6.1 million people with felony convictions are not eligible to vote. Florida is one of just 4 states that bar ex-felons from voting for life. The other states are Iowa, Kentucky, and Virginia. The Brennan Center for Justice reports that Florida disenfranchises more citizens than Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee combined.
We're now joined by Desmond Meade, president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, who's leading the fight to re-enfranchise felons in Florida. He's also chair of the Floridians for a Fair Democracy. He himself is an ex-offender who was previously homeless. He's still disenfranchised. We're also joined by Ari Berman, a senior writer at Mother Jones, reporting fellow at the Nation Institute, and author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. His latest piece from Mother Jones, Inside the Unlikely Movement That Could Restore Voting Rights to 1.4 million Floridians. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Desmond, let's begin with you. Talk about what's on the ballot in November in Florida and what this means.
Good morning, Amy, and thank you for having me on the show. When you ask what's on the ballot, I think that what's on the ballot is solutions. You just previously talked about the problems. But I think Amendment 4 is all about solutions and about a different way of really moving issues in this country. When you're seeing people from all walks of life, from all political persuasions, from all races that have actually come together and create a very impressive grassroots movement that's poised to make history on November 6th, that's what's right about this movement. That's what's right about this country. So we're very excited about it.
Well, could you talk about what the situation is now for an ex-felon, how difficult it is to regain your voting rights, and what this law, if it's passed in a referendum in Amendment 4, would do?
Yes, of course. In the state of Florida, and it's probably the worst in the entire country, a person has to wait either 5 or 7 years before they're just allowed to apply. And once they apply, what we've seen are people waiting upwards of 10+ years just to get a shot at having a hearing. And if they're lucky enough to get a hearing, when they walk in the door, they have probably about 1% of chance of actually getting their civil rights restored. And so that is indicative of a broken system. I think the courts have declared it a broken system, and Amendment 4 seeks to fix that.
Ari Berman, talk about the history of this.
The history of this law dates back to the Jim Crow era. So in 1868, Florida had to ratify the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment to rejoin the Union. So they had to ratify voting rights for Black Americans. So what Florida did is they massively expanded the number of felonies in the state. And then they made it so that if you had a felony, you couldn't vote. And this disproportionately targeted African Americans to the point after this law passed, 95% of prisoners in Florida's felon camps were African American. So this was absolutely a Jim Crow era law. And now it's spread beyond African Americans to the entire state. So you have a situation where in Florida, about 1.7 million people can't vote. This amendment would restore the right to vote to 1.4 million of those people. 500,000 are African American. The rest of them are white and Latino, and I think that's one of the reasons why you've seen such a big coalition rally behind this, because it's not just African Americans that are being disenfranchised. A lot of white Republican Trump supporters can't vote in Florida either, but the numbers are just so staggering. You're talking about 10% of people in the country's most important swing state not being able to vote. And I think all the attention on Georgia voter suppression is warranted, but we're talking about 53,000 people in Georgia who have pending registrations. In Florida, we're talking about 1.4 million people that might get the right to vote back. So more people right now are disenfranchised in Florida than any other state. And that's why Amendment 4 is so important.
And could you talk about the movement that's built around it in terms of what kind of support it has? It has bipartisan support?
It's a really remarkable movement that Desmond and others have built. I mean, you're talking about groups from the ACLU to the Christian Coalition to the Koch brothers network that are supporting this. I mean, these groups rarely agree on anything, particularly in the Trump era, and they're supporting this. And what's fascinating to me is that it needs 60% of support from voters to pass. So that's already a pretty high bar. Right now, polling shows that it has about 70 to 75% support. So that's amazing. And I think what's fascinating is you have a movement by Republicans all across the country to make it harder to vote. But on the ground in Florida, Republicans are supporting this. And what it tells me is that if you get out of the politics, if you get out of talking to politicians and you go straight to the people, this kind of stuff is popular, that restoring voting rights to ex-felons, automatic registration, early voting, there is broad-based support for a democracy and justice agenda in this country, and what's happening in Florida right now shows that.
I mean, just to show the significance, go back to 2016. Trump won Florida, beat Hillary Clinton by almost 113,000 votes. 113,000 votes. We're talking about 1.4 million voters now more voters being eligible to vote in Florida.
The number of people disenfranchised in Florida is far larger than the margin of victory in both presidential elections and Senate elections. So Governor Rick Scott, who's overseen the felon disenfranchisement law, has won 2 elections by 60,000 votes at a time that 1.4 million people couldn't vote in the state. You go back to the 2000 election in Florida, thousands of voters were wrongly labeled as ex-felons and purged from the rolls, which likely cost Al Gore the election. Then a much larger number of people weren't even able to vote in the first place. So this felon disenfranchisement law has swung elections. It's disenfranchised millions of people. I think a lot of people realize it's a relic of Jim Crow. It's finally time we end this and we move on. We give people second chances.
And Desmond Meade, I'd like to ask you, talk about your personal experience. When was the last time, because you're an ex-felon who also has not been able to vote, when was the last time you voted?
I think it was during the time of Moses, you know. But no, actually, the last time I voted was when I was serving in the military, and that's been quite a number of years. So that's, you know, it's an act that now I think I treasure even more than I did back then, and that's something I'm looking forward to do. You know, I mean, we have citizens across this great state of ours who have made mistakes in the past and have paid their debts. And this is a country that really believes that when a debt is paid, guess what? It's paid. And it's time for us to move on and experience what being a citizen is all about. And there's no greater expression than that than being able to vote.
I wanted to turn to a map of the country and talk about the states. 2 states in the country in which everyone, including people with felony convictions, are allowed to vote. Maine and Vermont, you can vote from jail. In the most restrictive states, Florida, Virginia, Kentucky, and Iowa, all people with felony convictions are permanently disenfranchised. Florida has the highest number, as has been said, of disenfranchised voters. 1.4 million adults in the state can't vote because of having a felony conviction. So Desmond Meade, in this bipartisan coalition that has formed. Talk about what it's like to work with these different groups, and what do the polls indicate for November?
Well, first of all, we don't even call ourselves a bipartisan movement. We are an organic grassroots movement that welcomes and enjoys bipartisan support. We're not leading with the partisan nature of this topic or the issue of voting. What we're leading with is the human nature, you know, that there are real people's lives who are impacted by these policies. And because of that, we've been able to, first of all, recognize that felon disenfranchisement now impacts people from all walks of life, which now allows us to go into communities in rural parts of Florida, in urban parts of Florida, and have real conversations with real people and really connect with the pain that they're feeling. Because of that, what we've seen is indicative of what we're seeing now with the hurricane relief efforts that we've always seen. That in the aftermath of a hurricane, no one cares how their neighbor voted. No one cares how much money they made. Only thing they see is another human being in need. And that's the beautiful part of this campaign that we have embraced and we hold on to for dear life, because at the end, we are organizing folks along the lines of humanity. And because of that, we've been able to get people that throw off their partisan cloaks and come together as brothers and sisters in this movement, as Americans that's rallying around each other, knowing that once a debt is paid, it's paid. So we can have organizations like the Tax Watch, Christian Coalition, Freedom Partners that stand up and say, you know what, it is time to bring second chances back to the state of Florida. And they could do that alongside the ACLU, organizations like Advancement Project, Alliance for Safety and Justice, and Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. That is, to me, the most beautiful thing that we're witnessing here. I believe that we are becoming a shining light for the rest of the country about what's good when people can elevate themselves above partisan bickering, above racial discord, and connect along the lines of humanity for the good of all people.
Ari, I'd like to move from Florida to another state that's also a scene of a disproportionate targeting of a racial minority. The Supreme Court has ruled it will allow the state of North Dakota to enforce a new voter ID requirement that will make it harder for Native Americans to vote during the midterm elections. The state's new voter ID law requires voters to show identification that demonstrates a residential street address. But this has already rendered many tribal IDs invalid, since many Native Americans who live on reservations depend on post office boxes to receive their mail. The law could make a big difference in the close race between Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp and her Republican challenger, Kevin Cramer. The race is expected to help decide who controls the Senate. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, so the North Dakota voter ID law has flown under the radar relative to Georgia, but it's just as serious, because the way this Republican voter ID law is written is that most tribal IDs are not going to be accepted because they do not have a residential address in them. Many Native Americans live in rural areas on reservations. They don't have addresses. They get their mail at the post office. There's nothing wrong with that, but this law was specifically written to not allow P.O. boxes count as an address. So what's happening now in North Dakota is that thousands of Native Americans could be disenfranchised by this Republican voter ID law. According to federal court statistics, 20% of eligible Native American voters don't have the correct ID. And that means about 5,000 Native American voters might not be able to vote in the next election. And then we're running out of time to try to get them the correct IDs right now. I mean, we're basically 20 days away from the election. And Heidi Heitkamp only won her first race for the Senate by 3,000 votes with strong Native support. Now you're talking about a much larger percentage of Native Americans who could be disenfranchised. So this one voter ID law in North Dakota could cost Heidi Heitkamp her Senate seat and could cost Democrats control of the Senate. So it's a very, very serious situation. We're also talking about the most historically disenfranchised group in this country who faces all sorts of barriers today. And now, 30 days before the election, they find out they might not be able to vote in a critical midterm election. It's absolutely shocking and appalling what's happening in North Dakota.
It's also particularly interesting that this is happening at a time of Trump continually attacking Senator Elizabeth Warren, trying to use the word Pocahontas, the name Pocahontas, as a pejorative to describe her. She has now gone and gotten a DNA test, which she says from a Stanford professor, that says she has Native American lineage and ancestry, as she looks like she's about to announce her bid for 2020 for the 2020 presidential election.
Well, just imagine, Amy, if voter suppression in North Dakota got a fraction of the attention of Elizabeth Warren's DNA test or Donald Trump's Pocahontas slurs. And I think what we should be focusing on instead of her ancestry is all the barriers that are being faced by Native Americans in this country. And you can go down every single statistic and you see the problems. But particularly with voting, there was a long history of disenfranchising Native American voters, of making polling places very inaccessible, of gerrymandering districts so they don't have representation. And now, right before an election, a new voter ID law is put into place that could disenfranchise thousands of Native voters. To me, this is absolutely outrageous. It's un-American. And the fact if this election in North Dakota is tainted by voter suppression, you can't reverse it. And so right now, people have to do everything they can to get Native Americans so that they can get the IDs they need to vote. But this law was specifically written, it's very, very clear, to disenfranchise Native American voters in North Dakota.
And Ari, what are in terms of the fact that we're only weeks away from the midterm elections, clearly the Florida referendum, whatever happens there will only take effect for the next elections. But what can be done now in Georgia and in North Dakota to be able to have these folks have their right to vote before this election?
So in Georgia, there's a lawsuit filed to allow the pending registrations to go through. Even if you are on pending registration, you can show up and vote with an ID at the poll. So it's very important people know that they can vote. In North Dakota, the tribal authorities are going to have basically temporary IDs. They're going to give people letters saying they have an address. Poll workers are supposed to accept that, but we have to be very, very vigilant here. And that's why issues like election protection are going to be so important, because I'm extremely worried people are going to show up in Georgia, they're going to show up in North Dakota, they might even have the right documents, and election workers won't be able to, won't tell them that they're able to vote.
And ballot initiatives that have, that will ease restrictions in other parts of the country?
Well, this is huge because there's ballot initiatives in 7 states that would dramatically expand voting rights, from restoring voting rights to ex-felons in Florida to making it easier to register to vote in Michigan and Nevada to cracking down on gerrymandering in places like Colorado and Utah. And so despite all the focus on voter suppression, there is an opportunity to dramatically expand voting rights in 2018, and there is the best opportunity in a decade to make it easier to vote for millions of people. So I think that while all the focus is on suppression in 2018, the landscape for voting rights could look dramatically different in 2020 if all of these ballot initiatives pass, or even if some of them just pass in 2018.
Well, we want to thank you both for being with us. Ari Berman of Mother Jones will link to your pieces, and Desmond Meade of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. Desmond, I'll see you on Saturday night in Melbourne, Florida at the Gleason Performing Arts Center. We'll be doing a public conversation about this groundbreaking amendment that has been proposed in Florida, Amendment 4. When we come back, we continue our conversation with Carol Anderson, author of One Person, No Vote. Stay with us.
You're looking good, changing the game, going strong against the grain. I can tell by the way you move, you're a soldier of love, and you see right through that mean old monster of conquer and divide. Racist crushers of culture, nature, languages, and life. Wild seed brings sweet surprises. All of us win when one
Power,
of
Justice,
us
Love by
rises.
Morley. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We're continuing our conversation on voting rights. Still with us is Professor Carol Anderson, author of the new book, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. The book looks at how African-American voter participation has been systematically compromised since the 2013 Supreme Court decision that gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In her new book, Anderson tracks the subsequent rise of voter suppression laws across the United States so that by 2016 election, the number of black voters nationwide dropped from 66% turnout to under 60%. The discrepancy was greater in certain key areas, like Milwaukee, where turnout went down from 78% in 2012 to less than 50% 4 years later. President Trump won Wisconsin by a margin of fewer than 23,000 votes.
And Carol Anderson is chair of the African American Studies Department at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Again, her book, One Person, One Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. So, Professor Anderson, would you say that President Trump won in 2016 because of voter suppression?
Absolutely. Absolutely. in White Rage, in the epilogue of White Rage, one of the things that I looked at was voter suppression in Wisconsin and felony disfranchisement in Florida. In those two states alone, so that in 2016, there were 60,000 fewer voters in votes cast in 2016 in Wisconsin. 68% of that drop came out of Milwaukee, where 70% of the state's black population lives. And so in that, and Milwaukee is a Democratic stronghold. So the change there, because of the voter suppression put in place by Scott Walker and the Republican legislature, that specifically targeted Milwaukee, that had a massive shift. And so that narrow margin that Trump won in Wisconsin, that is due to what happened there in Milwaukee. And in fact, a study showed that 8% of whites could not vote because of voter ID laws. But 27% of African Americans in Wisconsin could not vote because of voter ID laws. Voter suppression swung the Electoral College in Wisconsin to Trump. And then with felony disfranchisement in Florida, just looking at the numbers there, and the numbers show that 80% of those who are disfranchised are Democrats, and that in terms of voter turnout rate for those who have regained their full citizenship rights, their voting rights, is that you're looking at about a 20% turnout rate. Just running those numbers alone, it showed that the 100,000+ margin that Trump won, in fact, would have flipped to over 200,000+ for Hillary Clinton. Those two states alone, the Electoral College victory in those two states alone would have swung to Hillary Clinton. Trump won by voter suppression.
Well, Carol Anderson, I'd like to ask you, one of the chapters in your book, you detail the various ways that voter suppression has been used in recent years, especially after the Supreme Court Shelby decision. But chapter 3, you talk about voter roll purges, and I want to just read the first few sentences there. The story read like something straight out of Stalinist Russia, but this casualty list was the United States in the 21st century. Virginia, 41,637 purged. Florida, 182,000 purged. Indiana, 481,235 purged. Georgia, 591,549 purged. Ohio, 2 million purged. The issue of how the purging of rolls, now clearly many rolls in many cities especially are need to be purged because people move and they forget to re-register, or they re-register and their old address is still there. But these are astounding numbers in terms of purges across the country in many of these states.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the National Voter Registration Act is very clear about how voter roll maintenance is supposed to happen. But what we see are very aggressive secretaries of state who are skipping over many of those steps and going straight to non-voting as the reason why people are being purged. And so what we have here, for instance, in Georgia, is that Brian Kemp's office has said, we don't purge people because they haven't voted regularly. We purge people because they haven't had regular contact with election officials. But if you haven't changed your name, then you're not going to have a contact with election officials. If you haven't moved out of one voting precinct, one jurisdiction to another, not moving within, but moving outside of, then you're not going to have contact. And so the only reason you haven't had regular contact then is that you haven't voted regularly. Well, what we know from the research is that minorities, poor people, and young people don't vote regularly. And so it becomes a way, by using that characteristic as a way to wipe them off of the voter rolls. From 2016 to 2018, so in the past 2 years, a Brennan Center report shows that Kemp's office has removed 10.6% of registered voters off of the rolls in Georgia. Over 10% have been removed off of the rolls in the past 2 years. That's not voter roll maintenance. That is really beginning to cull the electorate.
You know, it seems like a path to governorship or Senate is to be Secretary of State of any state, right, where you're going to determine who is going to vote. Now, if you could talk, Carol Anderson, broadly in the country, but using specific examples of, as you talk about, you're a professor, chair of African American Studies at Emory, what the research shows about the limitations that are put on voters and who that disproportionately affects, why people of color and poor people are most disproportionately affected, using specific examples.
Yes, and so the best way to talk about this, for instance, voter IDs. Voter IDs sound really innocuous, but they're based on the lie, the fraud of voter fraud, the lie of voter fraud. Voter fraud is a myth. Justin Levitt, a professor out of California, proved that from 2000 to 2014, there had been 1 billion votes in the United States. Out of those 1 billion, he was able to document 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud. 31 out of 1 billion. So that's about 2 a year. Based on that lie of massive, rampant voter fraud, we get this movement toward voter IDs to protect the integrity of the ballot box. So it's what Ari Berman talked about. So you write the laws in terms of the kinds of IDs and what those IDs must have. And so you write those laws, for instance, in North Dakota. So now Native Americans are not going to be able to vote in mass the way they could have because of a simple tweak in that law of voter ID that is based on a lie. And so what we see as well in Alabama, what Alabama did in terms of voter suppression, its voter ID law, is it said, okay, you have to have a government-issued photo ID. The Legal Defense Fund noted that somehow public housing ID was not on that list of government-issued photo ID. Alabama is a poor state. They have many people in public housing, 71% of whom are African American. But Alabama ruled that public housing ID was not an acceptable form of government-issued photo ID. But it doesn't get more government issued than public housing. And then what Alabama did was say, okay, but you know, your driver's license will count. Then Alabama shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties. And those are counties in Alabama that are overwhelmingly poor and that also have a large number of African Americans. And so now you had at least about a 50-mile trip in order to get to the nearest Department of Motor Vehicles. Well, Alabama is ranked 48th in the nation in public transportation. So you don't have public transportation to go the 50 miles to get the driver's license. But if you don't have a driver's license, how do you drive 50 miles?
Well, Carol Anderson,
right.
We have
Yes.
about a minute left. I wanted to ask you to also talk about gerrymandering, which many people accept these days as a fact of life. But what has the impact of gerrymandering on voting?
Yeah, the gerrymandering, extreme partisan gerrymandering, has diluted the vote. It depresses the vote because you have non-competitive races. But what it's also done is to put 16 to 26 additional Republican seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. And it's created these kinds of safe, rotten borough districts where politicians were able to choose their voters instead of their voters choosing them. This is why you see that kind of massive disparity. When Congress is moving to cut and gut the Affordable Care Act, but 70% of Americans want that act strengthened. They want access to health care. Where you see the majority, the overwhelming majority of Americans did not want that tax bill that moved $1.5 trillion to the uber wealthy. Yet you had Congress sailing that bill through. That is because they did not have to be responsive to the will of the voters. That's what gerrymandering does.
Carol Anderson, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Chair of African American Studies Department, Emory Emory University, author of One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. She'll be speaking at the Schomburg Center here in New York on October 25th. I'll be speaking on Friday night in Gainesville, Florida at the Forage Hall at Working Food Community Center, 7 p.m. Saturday. I'll be in Melbourne, Florida with Desmond Meade and ACLU Florida's Executive Director Howard Simon. Check our website. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.